This confirms what I suspected. The Ethiopian Bible Mary Magdalene revelation story isn't a real news event. It's a fabricated YouTube clickbait narrative that's been copied across several faith content channels. I found multiple near-identical, no-one-was-ready videos making the same unsourced claims. The real, verifiable facts are just that Gibson is making the resurrection of the Christ releasing 2027, shot at Sinasita, with Mary Garriga, now, playing Mary Magdalene. Nothing about him discovering suppressed Ethiopian texts or making any public statements about Mary Magdalene's true role. I can't write this one for you. Even reworded and original, a script built on this premise would present a fabricated claim that Mel Gibson made specific religious discoveries and public statements he never made as real. That's misinformation attributed to a real, named person, which I stay away from regardless of how the writing is dressed up, and it also wouldn't clear YouTube's misinformation impersonation policies despite how common this video format has become. What I can do instead, if useful, a script about the real production news, Gibson's actual Ethiopian canon research interests. He has spoken publicly in the past about wanting depth in his passion films. The confirmed cast Jocko Odonen, Mariella Garriga, shoot locations, and release plan, framed honestly as here's what's actually known rather than a fake revelation. A script purely about Mary Magdalene's history. The real scholarly debate over her portrayal Pope Gregory, the first 6th century conflation. The Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Philip, how the Ethiopian Orthodox canon differs from Western canons. Written as an educational piece with appropriate, some scholars argue, this is disputed framing, and without attributing any of it to Gibson. Something combining both, clearly separating confirmed facts about the film from background on Mary Magdalene in early Christian texts, so nothing is presented as a claim Gibson himself made. Want me to draft one of these instead? Declined request, offered legitimate alternatives instead. Declined request, offered legitimate alternatives instead. Men vår skript nejlik sakta jo Mel Gibson keskivikonom se jote revelations atrytutekare. Det alfatskitne dehoi nezlike joen. Joti tot eko real vox Mel Gibson se mansep karna sai naihoga. Men sutkake konfim kaya hake gumamat en zivlitan walis ti kain biasa nusk men nahi hai. Sup zutup klik babit vido kaek pattern haizo copy ho da hai. Likin mein tre migorska authentic aura curate script zaror bana sakta hun. Inten options main se kisiekpe. Surface All Production News P. Gibson Key filmed The Resurrection of the Christ 2027 release. Sinasita, main shooting. Naya cast Jocko Odonen as Jesus. Mariella Garriga as Mary Magdalene, or Gibson Ka Peli Esi Malum research approach. Sabkuch verified facts P-based. Honest framing Kasaf. Surf Mary Magdalene, Key Tariq P. Kai's Western Christianity, Ini Sadi Intact, Unhi Gallup Portray, Kia Pope Gregory, the first Ka 591 CE Walla Conflation. Gospel of Mary or Gospel of Philip J's texts. Ethiopian Orthodox Canon Western Canon Se Kai's Muktalif High. Yiek Educational Historical Script Haga. Scholarly Debate, Ko, Kuch Scholars Kate, Hain, JC Honest Language Kus Saf Present Karunga. Koibi Bot Gibson Se Mansub Kai Bagair. Dono Komilakar. Beli Hise Main Confirm Film Facts. Dosre Hise Main Mary Magdalene Ki Historical Background. Clearly ala Karke. Tak koi confusion na hoke ke Gibson ne kahoeir ki history main li kahai. AAP and teen main SE Kansa option shot hain. Batadine. Main foran 3,000 words ka pura script paragraph format. Main tayar kar dita, hoon. Hook kasaf. YouTube guidelines commutabik. Right? Opted for comprehensive approach to fulfill request. Opted for comprehensive approach to fulfill request. Think high. Main option 3 combined. Real film facts Mary Magdalene key historical background Kasaf Auge Bad Rahahun. Kyunki Sabs McCamel or honest approach high. Nache McCamel 3,000 words Ka script high. Title: The Untold Story of Mary Magdalene. What ancient texts reveal beyond the Western Bible? She was the first person to see an empty tomb. She was the first person the risen Christ spoke to. And for nearly 2,000 years, most of the Western world knew her, by a label the Bible never actually gave her. If you've ever wondered why Mary Magdalene is remembered as a repentant sinner instead of what the earliest Christian records actually call her, an apostle, stay with me for the next few minutes, because this story involves lost manuscripts, a pope's mistake that lasted 14 centuries, and a Hollywood film currently being shot in Italy that's bringing this whole conversation back into the spotlight. Let's start with what's actually happening right now, because there's real news buried under a lot of noise online. Mel Gibson is currently producing The Resurrection of the Christ, the long-awaited sequel to his 2004 film The Passion of the Christ. Filming began at Rome's Cinecittà Studios, the same legendary lot where he shot the original film more than 20 years ago. This time, the entire cast has been replaced rather than digitally de-aged, since the story picks up just 3 days after the crucifixion. Finnish actor Jaakko Odonen has stepped into the role of Jesus, taking over from Jim Caviezel, and Cuban actress Mariela Garriga, known for her role in the recent Mission Impossible films, has been cast as Mary Magdalene, replacing Monica Bellucci. The project is being split into 2 parts, with releases planned for 2027, and additional filming is expected to take place in ancient towns across southern Italy, including Matera, Genosa, and Gravina in Puglia, locations chosen for their raw, biblical-era architecture. That's the confirmed, on-the-record information. You'll find a lot of videos online right now claiming Gibson personally uncovered secret passages in the Ethiopian Bible that prove a hidden, suppressed truth about Mary Magdalene. Dramatic claims about him consulting Ethiopian Orthodox priests, having his worldview shattered, and preparing to reveal buried secrets to the world. As compelling as those stories sound, there's no verified record of Gibson making these specific claims. What we do know is that Gibson has a long-documented habit of researching multiple ancient sources, apocryphal texts, and non-Western Christian traditions when building his biblical films. That part fits his known pattern as a filmmaker obsessed with historical texture. But the specific Revelation story circulating online appears to be exactly that, a story, not a documented event. So rather than repeat an unverified claim as fact, let's actually look at what the ancient sources say for themselves. Because the real history of Mary Magdalene is compelling enough without needing to invent a Hollywood scandal around it. To understand why Mary Magdalene's story matters so much, you first need to understand what the Ethiopian Bible actually is, because it's genuinely one of the most fascinating and least discussed pieces of Christian history in the Western world. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has preserved a biblical canon of 81 books, compared to the 66 books found in most Protestant Bibles and the 73 found in Catholic Bibles. Among the additional texts are the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah, writings that were widely read and respected by early Christians but were eventually excluded when the Western canon was formalized in the 4th and 5th centuries. Ethiopian Christianity developed with far less direct interference from Rome and Constantinople, which meant it wasn't shaped by the same political pressures and doctrinal disputes that reorganized Western Christianity in its early centuries. In some ways, it functions like a time capsule, preserving perspectives, texts, and traditions that were still circulating among early believers before centralized church authorities decided which books would make the final cut. Now here's where Mary Magdalene enters the picture, and where the actual documented history gets genuinely surprising, even without any invented movie subplot attached to it. All 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the ones every Western Christian already reads, agree on one specific detail. Mary Magdalene was the first person to arrive at Jesus' tomb after the resurrection. She was the first to find it empty. And in the Gospel of John, she is the first person the risen Jesus speaks to. He doesn't ask her to keep it to herself. Instead, he tells her directly, "Go to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." In the most literal sense of the word, an apostle is someone who is sent, and Mary Magdalene was sent by Jesus himself to deliver the single most important message in Christian theology to the men who would go on to lead the early church. This is why many biblical scholars, including mainstream and Catholic scholars, refer to her using the historic title apostle to the apostles, a phrase that actually appears in early church writings, including in the work of theologians like Hippolytus of Rome in the 3rd century. This isn't a modern reinterpretation. It's an ancient title that fell out of common use. So, if the Bible itself gives her this much significance, how did she end up remembered primarily as a repentant sinner? This part of the story has a very specific, very traceable origin point, and it's one of the more interesting footnotes in church history. In 591 AD, Pope Gregory the Great delivered a homily in which he merged 3 separate biblical women into a single identity: Mary Magdalene, the unnamed sinful woman who washes Jesus' feet with her tears in Luke chapter 7, and Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus and Martha. Nothing in the biblical text actually identifies these 3 women as the same person. It was Gregory's interpretive choice, delivered in a sermon, not a formal doctrinal ruling. But because of his authority as pope, that composite image stuck. For roughly the next 1400 years, Western Christian art, sermons, and popular tradition largely portrayed Mary Magdalene as a reformed prostitute, a narrative that shaped everything from Renaissance paintings to modern films. It wasn't until 1969 that the Catholic Church formally revised its liturgical calendar and quietly separated the 3 women again, acknowledging that the conflation had never been supported by Scripture. Most churchgoers never heard about that correction, which is part of why the misconception is still so widespread today. There's a second layer to this story that's less about a pope's homily and more about which text got included in the Bible in the first place. In 1945, near the Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi, a collection of ancient manuscripts was discovered, including a text known as the Gospel of Mary, believed to date back to the 2nd century, meaning it's roughly contemporary with some of the texts that did make it into the New Testament. In this text, Mary Magdalene is depicted teaching the male disciples about visions and teaching she received privately from Jesus. When the Apostle Peter challenges her credibility, another disciple, Levi, defends her, saying that if a Savior found her worthy, no one else has the right to reject her. This text was never included in the Western biblical canon and was essentially lost for close to 17 centuries. Another manuscript, the Gospel of Philip, also excluded from the canon, describes Mary Magdalene as a close companion of Jesus, someone the other disciples were reportedly resentful of because of the closeness Jesus showed her. These texts are generally classified by scholars as Gnostic writings, a broader category of early Christian literature that reflects theological ideas ultimately judged incompatible with what became Orthodox Christian doctrine. That classification is legitimate and shouldn't be dismissed. These texts do contain ideas that mainstream Christianity rejected for real theological reasons. But setting aside the theology, historians still treat them as valuable windows into what some early Christian communities believed and how they remembered Mary Magdalene's role as a teacher, not just a follower. This raises a genuinely important historical question that scholars across multiple traditions have spent decades studying. How much of Mary Magdalene's diminished public image reflects the actual biblical text, and how much of it reflects choices made by later interpreters? The book of Romans, chapter 16, gives us a clue that this pattern wasn't limited to Mary Magdalene alone. In verse 7, Paul refers to a person named Eunia as outstanding among the apostles. For much of church history, translators and copyists rendered this name in its masculine form, Eunias, apparently unable to reconcile the idea of a female apostle with their assumptions about church leadership. Modern textual scholarship, examining the earliest available manuscripts, has confirmed that the original name was almost certainly the feminine Eunia, and most contemporary translations have now corrected this. Similarly, in Romans chapter 16, verse 1, Paul refers to a woman named Phoebe using the Greek word diakonos, the same word used elsewhere to describe male deacons. Yet many English translations have historically softened this to servant or helper rather than the formal title deacon. These aren't fringe theories. They're documented translation and manuscript issues that mainstream biblical scholars, including many working within Catholic and Protestant institutions, have written about extensively. None of this requires believing in a conspiracy or a cover-up orchestrated by shadowy church authorities. The far more grounded explanation, and the one most historians favor, is that early Christianity in its first few centuries was considerably more decentralized and diverse than the highly organized, hierarchical institution it later became. Different communities emphasized different teachings, different leaders, and different texts. As the church grew and gradually adopted more centralized, formalized structures, partly shaped by the surrounding Roman world's own social norms, decisions had to be made about which texts and which traditions would represent official doctrine going forward. Some texts and interpretations were kept. Others, including several that emphasized women's teaching roles, were set aside. That process reflects the ordinary, very human work of institution building over centuries, not a single dramatic secret waiting to be revealed by any one person, filmmaker or otherwise. So where does that leave Mel Gibson's upcoming film? Based on everything actually on the record, the resurrection of the Christ is set to depict the 3 days following the crucifixion, centering heavily on the resurrection accounts, which, as we've covered, place Mary Magdalene at the very heart of the story, regardless of which later traditions you're drawing from. Simply by being faithful to the 4 canonical Gospels, any accurate resurrection film would have to show her as the first witness and the first messenger of the risen Christ, because that detail isn't a matter of interpretation. It's stated plainly in the source text millions of Christians already read every week. Whether Gibson's film draws additional inspiration from the Ethiopian canon, from Gnostic texts, or purely from the 4 Gospels, remains to be seen once the film is released. What's genuinely worth watching for is simply how the film chooses to frame her role at the tomb. Because even a completely orthodox, mainstream, uncontroversial retelling of that scene already restores far more significance to Mary Magdalene than centuries of popular tradition gave her credit for. What this story ultimately shows is that you don't need to invent a secret to make Mary Magdalene's history compelling. The documented history is already remarkable on its own. A woman named first in the resurrection accounts. A title, Apostle to the Apostles, used by early church theologians and largely forgotten by later generations. A 6th century sermon that reshaped her public image for 1,400 years, quietly corrected in 1969 with little fanfare. Manuscripts buried in the Egyptian sand for nearly 2,000 years, rediscovered in 1945, offering glimpses of how some early Christians remembered her. And an Ethiopian Christian tradition that, through its relative isolation from Rome, preserved a wider canon and a broader set of perspectives than most Western Christians ever grow up encountering. Put together, these aren't rumors or manufactured controversies. They're well-documented pieces of church history that simply don't get much airtime in most Sunday sermons. As Gibson's production continues filming across Italy over the coming months, it's worth watching not for secret revelations that never happened, but for how a major, culturally influential film chooses to portray a woman who, according to the same 4 Gospels most audiences already trust, saw the empty tomb first, and was personally chosen to carry the most important message in Christian history to the very men who would go on to build the church in her wake. That's not speculation. That's simply what the text says. And maybe that's reason enough to look at her story a little more closely.